On the morning of March 24th, 1873, in the yard of Durham Jail, a woman named Mary Ann Cotton stood on a wooden trapdoor with a hood over her face. The lever was pulled. She fell. She did not die. For 3 full minutes, in front of the assembled witnesses, she strangled at the end of the rope, and the executioner, a man named William Calcraft, had to climb down and press his own weight onto her shoulders to finish what the fall should have done instantly. What killed her, in the end, was not the rope. It was the drop, the distance she fell before the rope caught, and nobody standing in that yard that morning had any real idea how to calculate it. For most of the history of judicial killing, that was normal. There was no science to it, no shared standard, no rule book that traveled from one town to the next. Whether a hanging was quick or an ordeal depended entirely on who happened to be holding the rope, and for centuries, that person answered to nobody but the local authority who had hired him. Before that changed, the question of how to kill a condemned person was never answered once. It was answered again and again, town by town, lord by lord, sheriff by sheriff. And the first place that pattern took root was not a gallows at all. It was a hole in the ground. The rite was called in Latin furca et fossa, piet and gallows. It was granted not to kings or national courts, but to individual feudal lords, and it meant precisely what it sounds like it meant. Any baron who held this right could try a person accused of a serious crime, pass sentence, and carry out that sentence entirely within the boundaries of his own land, answering to no higher court and no shared code of practice. In Scotland, this right was formalized as early as 1057, when a parliament assembled at Forfar under King Malcolm III required every baron holding pit and gallows to dig his own drowning pit for female offenders, sited near his own Moot Hill, the small rise of ground where his court convened to pass judgment. Men were hanged. Women were drowned. The equipment for both was built, maintained, and operated by whichever local lord happened to hold the land the accused was standing on when they were caught. Picture the mechanism. A baron's court met on the Moot Hill. A dempster, a court officer whose entire job was to pronounce sentence aloud, read the judgment. If the sentence was death by water, the condemned was walked to a pit, sometimes fed by a nearby river or loch, sometimes hand-dug and lined with stone. Some pits had a ladder lowered in so the condemned could climb down under guard. Then the ladder was pulled up. There was no calculated depth, no measured time, no drop at all in the sense the word would later carry. There was only water, and whether it was deep enough, and how long the guard standing above chose to wait. This worked, from the Lord's perspective, exactly as intended. A crime was committed, a court convened, a sentence was carried out, all within a single afternoon, all within a single estate, all without ever consulting an authority outside the barony's own boundary. It failed everywhere else. A woman convicted of theft on one baron's land might drown in a pit dug that same morning. A woman convicted of the identical crime on the neighboring baron's land, a few miles distant, might face a different pit, a different depth, a different pair of hands deciding how long was long enough. There was no traveling standard, no inspector, no written formula passed between estates. The only thing every baron shared was the right itself, never the method. Bones have since been recovered near several of these pit sites, buried close by rather than in consecrated ground, a detail that says something on its own about who these people were considered to be once the water had finished its work. This arrangement did not vanish with the end of the feudal era. It simply changed shape. When capital punishment across Britain consolidated centuries later around a single method, hanging, The underlying pattern did not disappear. The pit was gone. The gallows remained. The decision of who built it, who operated it, and how far a person was allowed to fall before the rope caught still belonged to whoever happened to be standing closest to the rope. Once hanging became the near-universal method of execution across England, the job of carrying it out did not become a profession. It became a local errand. There was no national office of executioner, no training course, no license, no shared manual. Each county sheriff and each prison governor, quite independently of every other sheriff and governor in the country, hired whoever was willing to do the job when an execution was scheduled. Some hired local men with a trade on the side. Some simply took whoever the last hangman recommended before he died or retired. Record keeping reflected exactly how informal this was. Almost no documentation survives for hangmen working outside London before 1830, and for the town of Aberdeen specifically, nobody has ever established who carried out that town's executions between 1821 and 1824. The job passed from hand to hand, county to county, with no central register tracking who was doing it or how. This produced measurable, documented inconsistency in outcome, not theoretical inconsistency. In Staffordshire in February of 1881, a hangman gave a convicted man named James Williams a drop of 4 feet. Williams reportedly died without a struggle. In Durham 8 years earlier, a different hangman gave a convicted woman a drop closer to 3 feet, and she strangled for 3 minutes while he climbed beneath the gallows and pressed on her body to hasten her death. That hangman was Calcraft, and his career is the clearest evidence available for how little any of this depended on national policy rather than personal habit. Calcraft had been selling meat pies on the streets outside Newgate Prison when he happened to meet the City of London's executioner. When that man died in 1829, the position passed to Calcraft, a former cobbler with no training in anatomy, physics, or rope mechanics of any kind. He held the post for the next 45 years and personally carried out roughly 450 hangings, using a drop of around 3 feet on almost every one of them, regardless of the size or weight of the person standing on the trap door. Because the drop was too short to break the neck, Calcraft's prisoners typically died slowly, by strangulation, rather than fracture. To hasten a death he judged to be taking too long, Calcraft would climb beneath the scaffold and pull on the prisoner's legs, or in some cases climb onto their shoulders and use his own body weight to finish the job. This was not a secret. It was documented, witnessed, and widely known, and it continued for 4.5 decades because no sheriff outside London had any obligation to consult what any other county was doing, and no governing body existed to tell Calcraft his method was wrong. Mary Ann Cotton died under exactly this system. Whether her death took 3 minutes or 3 seconds had nothing to do with her crime, her trial, or her sentence. It depended entirely on which man her county happened to have hired, and what that particular man happened to believe about how far was far enough. A prisoner hanged that same year in a different county by a different hangman under a different unwritten habit stood a real chance of a faster death, purely as a matter of geography. What finally broke this pattern was not a change in the law. It was one hangman deciding to test whether the drop could be calculated at all. William Marwood was 54 years old and had never hanged anyone when he decided the entire system was solvable with mathematics. He was a cobbler in Lincolnshire, not an executioner, and he had spent years reading about work done by physicians in Ireland, who argued that a hanging drop could be calculated in advance based on a prisoner's body weight to guarantee that the neck broke instantly, rather than allowing the slow strangulation Calcraft's prisoners endured. Marwood believed it. In 1868, the governor of Lincoln Castle Jail had presided over the deeply distressing execution of a woman named Priscilla Biggadike. And when Marwood approached him 4 years later, asking to try his calculated method, the governor, having no wish to witness another execution like that one, agreed. On April 1st, 1872, Marwood hanged William Frederick Horry using a drop calculated specifically for Horry's weight, somewhere between 4 and 10 feet depending on the individual, with the knot positioned precisely beneath the jaw rather than off to one side. Horry's neck broke. There was no struggle. The execution that had terrified Lincoln's prison staff for years was over in seconds, and Marwood, a man with no formal training of any kind, had just demonstrated something no English hangman had ever proven before him. Death by hanging could be engineered, not guessed. Marwood was appointed official hangman for London and Middlesex within 2 years, replacing Calcraft directly. But his method still lived mostly in his own head. Unwritten, ungeneralized, exactly the kind of personal habit that had caused the problem in the first place. It took another British institution to turn Marwood's private calculation into something every county could use. In 1886, a government committee chaired by Lord Aberdare reviewed data from 23 separate executions, supplied by Marwood's successor, James Barry, who had refined the original method into a working formula relating drop length directly to a prisoner's weight in stone. The Aberdare Committee's findings pushed the Home Office to formalize what became known as the Official Table of Drops, issued in stages between 1888 and 1892, specifying the exact drop down to the inch for a prisoner of any given weight, targeting roughly 1,260 foot-pounds of force, delivered through a knot placed under the chin. For the first time, a hangman anywhere in England could open a printed table, find a prisoner's weight, and read off the correct drop, rather than relying on whatever he happened to believe. Sheriffs stopped hiring whoever was available, and began choosing from a list of hangmen and assistants formally approved by the prison commissioners. A scientific confirmation that cervical fracture, not asphyxiation, was the true cause of death under this method would not appear in print until researcher Frederick Wood Jones published his findings in 1913. But by then, the table had already been standard practice for 2 decades. It had taken 800 years to get from a baron's hand-dug pit to a printed formula in a government office. What nobody in that office could guarantee was that the formula would travel any further than Britain's own borders. 74 years after Marwood's first calculated drop, in a prison gymnasium in Nuremberg, Germany, the pattern returned in front of the entire world's press. On October 16, 1946, 10 senior Nazi officials, convicted at the Nuremberg trials, were scheduled to hang. The executioner was an American Army Master Sergeant named John C. Woods, who had volunteered for the role years earlier by claiming prior civilian hanging experience that was never verified. Woods had access to none of Britain's official table of drops. The United States Army's own execution manual specified a so-called standard drop, a fixed distance applied to every prisoner regardless of weight, closer in spirit to Calcraft's guesswork than to Marwood's calculation. The results were documented by multiple witnesses in the room. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's former foreign minister, took approximately 14 minutes to die by strangulation, rather than the near-instant death a properly calculated drop should have produced. Fritz Sockel took roughly the same amount of time. Wilhelm Keitel struggled for close to 28 minutes, and the trapdoor itself was too narrow for the men falling through it, causing several of them, Keitel included, to strike its edges and bleed heavily from head injuries on the way down. A British hangman named Albert Pierrepoint, trained under the calibrated system that grew directly out of Marwood's original method, was available and experienced. The Americans did not use him. This is the detail that reframes everything that came before it. Britain had spent 800 years, working its way from an unregulated pit dug by an individual baron to a printed national formula precise enough to specify a prisoner's drop down to the inch. That achievement did not automatically become anyone else's achievement. It existed on paper in one country's prison service, and it required someone to choose to use it. When the most watched executions of the 20th century were carried out by a different army, under a different manual, with no obligation to consult what Britain had already solved. The town by town, hangman by hangman. Variation the entire history of this subject had been trying to eliminate simply reappeared, this time on a global stage rather than a county one. The drop, by 1946, was a solved mathematical problem. Solved did not mean universal. It only meant available to whoever bothered to ask. Return for a moment to that morning in Durham in March of 1873. Had Mary Ann Cotton been hanged 4 years later, under Marwood's method rather than Calcraft's, a prison official would have weighed her, consulted a printed table, and calculated a drop, suited to exactly her body. The fall would have taken a fraction of a second. There would have been no need for anyone to climb beneath the gallows and press down on her shoulders. The crowd outside the prison walls would have heard nothing at all. That is the full weight of what changed and what it took to change it. A baron's hand-dug pit, answerable to nobody. A county sheriff hiring whichever man was willing, with no list, no license, and often no surviving record of who that man even was. A cobbler with no formal training who decided the problem could be solved with a table and a printed formula. And then, 74 years later, proof that a solved problem is not the same as a shared one. The moment a different army picked up the rope without ever consulting the table that already existed. For 8 centuries, the answer to how a person would die depended on where they happened to be standing when the sentence was passed. It still occasionally did, decades after anyone believed that problem had been solved. Same country, same decade, completely different odds depending on which county happened to hire you an executioner. Which one would you have wanted? So this is the kind of stuff I end up digging into every week. So if it's your thing too, stick around and subscribe.